Good morning, class. Welcome to today's lesson. Today, we continue discussing the pillars of sustainable development. And as we continue to get into the subtopics of each of these pillars of sustainable development, this week we will focus on ecological integrity. So as we often do, we begin by defining ecological integrity. Let's first look at the word integrity. So the word integrity implies the value of the whole of something. This entity, the integrity of the entity in terms of it being undiminished, its wholeness, or its perfection, its state or condition of being in perfection. So when we talk about integrity, that is what we mean. So as it relates to ecological integrity is the sum of the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of our environment. As we know, when we define ecology, we are looking at the physical, chemical, and biological components of our environment and how they relate to each other. So ecological integrity is the capacity of an ecosystem to support a full range of elements. And what are these elements? We would be concerned about being able to identify the genes contained within this ecosystem, the various species and collection of all organisms, as well as the processes that are taking place within that environment, such as mutation, other elements of major interest and concern would be the demography or the populations of that ecosystem, what biotic interactions are taking place, how nutrient and energy transfers occur, all right, and what are the natural processes involved. So if we have an interruption in any of these processes, we would have to be concerned now that our ecological integrity has the capacity to decline and be diminished. So as it applies to the natural environment, true examples are found in places that have been left relatively untouched by humans. All right, and many of these places across the world that still remain in this state of ecological integrity are really environments that are very inhospitable, such as desert areas, high altitude mountain ranges, ocean depths, and areas of forest that are very difficult to reach. Okay, these are some of the most pristine natural environments that we could probably identify and describe as having ecological integrity. So the most critical characteristic of ecological integrity is the ability of an ecosystem to sustain life. So how do all these physical, chemical, and biological characteristics, how do they work together and interact with each other to sustain life? So let's look at the ethics of ecological integrity. Since it is often impossible for many ecosystems to be left untouched by human activity, and we know this is true, human beings cannot exist in any environment without without interacting with your natural environment, because we depend on the natural environment. So for our very survival. So it is impossible to leave the environments within which we live untouched. So it is imperative, therefore, that human beings take responsibility for the management and preservation of our environment. So if you see here, if you recall the definition of sustainable development, we see that in order to maintain some level, we're not saying we can achieve full ecological integrity, but in order to maintain some level of ecological integrity, it is necessary for us to implement sustainable environmental management practices, all right? And that is done how? By managing our environment and preserving our environment. So this can appear, how do we do that? This can appear as standard setting, so setting environmental standards and best practices in terms of how we consume and interact with our environment. And how do we do that? This is often done through national laws at the national level. So for example, in Trinidad, we have the Environmental Management Act that is used for this purpose. In addition to national laws, national policies regarding, for example, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan for Trinidad and Tobago. So these are policies that work in conjunction with our laws in order to promote responsible human interaction and responsible management of our natural resources and our environment. In addition to national laws and policies, we also have international agreements, such as the UN Convention on Biodiversity, of which Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory. So many different countries will sign on to these agreements and collaborate in terms of information and knowledge exchange. And from that level, it filters back down to your national level where you now attempt to implement some of these strategies through the laws that we just spoke about and through national policies. So how do we measure ecological integrity? So as an environmental manager, we have come to appreciate the necessity of being able to measure certain things in the environment. And that measuring provides valuable data and information about what's happening in our environment to inform management policies and decision-making geared towards sustainable development, all right? So ecological integrity is measured, so we're on this point here, is measured as a degree to which a diverse community of native organisms is maintained and is used as an indicator for ecological resilience. So how strong or how resilient you are against external factors that can bring resistance to your environment. So for example, what do we mean? We, as an indicator, we would want to look at the presence of a diverse collection of species, the presence of it, and we'll want to look at numbers. How vast is it? What do those numbers look like? Is it trending upwards in terms of populations and variety, or is it trending downwards? Okay, so where we have a diverse collection of species, it increases the probability that at least some of these species have the capacity to survive in the face of climate change. So this is an external factor or an external pressure here, all right? So we're not only looking at the numbers of each category of species, but we're looking at the variety or the diversity of species. And once we collect information, that information, which is an indicator, we can now interpret and infer certain things. And in this case, we are inferring that it increases the probability of that some of these species will survive climate change conditions. So to measure ecological integrity, we know that indicators are very useful. Biodiversity indicators are communication tools that summarize data on complex environmental issues. So we know that these indicators provide data that tells us about the state of the environment and what impacts, helps us to understand the impacts on the environment. If you remember the DPSIR, I hope I got the number, the letters in correct order, if you remember that framework. And and the relationship between state, impact, drivers, pressures, all of these things, responses, etc., you should recall what I'm talking about, right? So these indicators are used to identify where the problems are and the extent of the problems that need to be addressed through policy and intervention. So indicators are used for monitoring. So we must be monitoring the state of our environment, in this case, our ecosystems. All right, we must be monitoring, and monitoring requires the use of indicators to collect data and information. All right, it helps us to understand the state of the environment or the trends. Are things improving? Is it escalating? And this information provides feedback for which policy development and management programs to be put in place. So these will be our interventions. Okay. So we know that through science, data is collected through the use of indicators. The data and information would then inform the knowledge of policy makers at government level, and policy will then inform the actions and the plans through programs that would be implemented as interventions to try to shift the direction to a more sustainable development approach. So some examples of how indicators are used to measure. For example, you may look at abundance and distribution of the selected species. Where are they located? How many? For example, mapping would prove to be very useful here as well. Indicators can measure the change in the status of threatened species. So what are the details regarding a particular threatened species? Are the numbers increasing? Are they continuing to decline? What programs or protections are put in place? Now, the IUCN list is available in your lesson resources. I believe you all should be familiar with this, possibly from your ENVS 316. However, I would refer you at this point to go check out that link just to refresh your memory and maybe select one or two species that are of interest to you, just to have a little familiarity on the subject matter. Okay, so continuing, indicators can also be used to measure the coverage of protected areas. So you want to be able to identify where are your protected areas. You want to be able to determine if you have gaps in your protected areas to know if policy and program interventions need to take place. And then also indicators can measure trends in invasive alien species in a particular ecosystem, because we know these alien species can throw off your ecological balance and reduce the resiliency of a particular ecosystem, right? So our data collection is used to facilitate effective indicators, and this must continue over a long period of time in order to determine trends. So the data collection is not something that you do for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks and then you finish. It must be an ongoing process, because what happens in our environment, to be able to identify trends, you must have data collection over a long period of time to be able to determine where we may have problems, okay? But the challenge with this is that it is often expensive and very time consuming. It's expensive in the sense that the numbers of persons, stakeholders, all the different parties involved that will have to be trained so that they can gain knowledge and expertise into not only why it's important to be monitoring the environment, they have to be trained in the use of indicators, They will have to be provided with equipment. And of course, as we said, it happens over a long period of time. So it's also very time consuming. So this is a major drawback here in terms of being able to measure ecological integrity through the use of indicators. Right. So next, let's look briefly at what happens or what actions can take place at a national level. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, we know is an international treaty, and it identifies common problem amongst member nations, but it is usually up to the individual countries to achieve the goals that have been set out at that international level. So usually we have all these different stakeholders and different interest groups that would be involved at that international convention level, where they come together to exchange ideas and information, and they come to agreement in terms of what the international goals should be. And participants, national participants, will return to their countries with the intention of trying to inform your national development strategies with biological diversity preservation as a main goal, all right? And we have many, at the national level, we have many stakeholders who would actually be involved, or who should actually be involved in a participatory approach. Because, for example, we have many private companies, landowners, fishermen, and farmers that take most of the actions that affect our biodiversity. So because they're consuming from our natural resources. So if these are the people who affect it, it makes sense that they should be the ones that should be involved in as part of the this participatory approach, where they can now get involved in by being trained and informed how to carry out best practices and how to monitor the ecosystems within which they operate in order to cooperate with the national goals and thereby the further international goals of preservation of biodiversity. So governments provide a critical role of leadership. They set rules that guide the use of our national resources. And by protecting biodiversity, where they have direct control over the land and the water. For example, some of the things that would be necessary to do that government can take leadership on is the identification and protection of the endangered species, the establishment of protected areas, promotion of education and awareness. Remember the previous slide, I just mentioned some of the various special interest groups who it would be beneficial to involve them in the carrying out and implementation of programs through training and awareness, all right? And all these different strategies of identifying endangered species, protected areas, awareness, etc. Much of this is defined in our national law, the Environmental Management Act, and many national plans, action plans, have been developed in line with the EM Act. So governments are required to do what? At the national level, they are required to develop national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So those action plans, for example, may be individual action plans through different ministries and different agencies, but those action plans should be designed and informed by the national biodiversity strategies or the national biodiversity policies, okay? So that being said, it is important as well to integrate these particularly where we have varying action plans, integrate them into broader national plans for the environment and development. For example, we would often have individual national policies for our different industries and different sectors: forestry, agriculture and fisheries, energy, transportation, urban planning. So it is important for governments to take a leadership role in ensuring that the overarching national biodiversity policies and strategies are accounted for in the various sectors. Okay, so that's what this point means. And of course, you can imagine that that will be a tremendous oversight role that at the government level that they will have to play to ensure that all these different sectors are actually falling in line with the recommendations, international recommendations on the preservation of biodiversity. So actions at the international level. So compliance by individual countries is often informed by self-interest of the individual countries. And well, of course, by this time, you should understand that we're referring to what is the main interest of the country. Is it economic development, or is it socio-economic development, or do we have a balance of all three spheres where we have true sustainable development goals in mind? Oftentimes that's not the case, but we just want to highlight that the self-interest of the country plays a major role in compliance to international conventions and agreement on biodiversity conservation and preservation. Additionally, compliance would also be influenced by peer pressure from other countries. For example, if other countries are monitoring the compliance of some countries are monitoring the compliance of some other countries, you may see that they may put possibly diplomatic pressures on them or trade pressures to try to force some countries to fall in line and to be in compliance with the international agreements. And then, of course, at the local level, pressure can be added to comply from public opinion. Of course, that public opinion would usually result from a well-informed, well-educated public groups. And then we have governments and non-governmental organizations, academics, private sector, and other interest groups, or even individuals that share ideas and compare strategies in a global forum. So many of the UN Global Forum on different issues now actually, they actually involve and have the participation of a number of non-governmental organizations and experts, and as we say here, other interest groups, in order to really build on that, that principle of participatory governance, in the sense that they all come together at this international conference to share their ideas and their knowledge, understanding, and information about these complex international environmental issues. For example, with different regions that experience particular problems, like, for example, the SIDS, small island developing states often experience different challenges from many other parts of the world. So you would have those represented by the SIDS, they come together to share their information. And that is where we would have changes and modifications taking place to with these international agreements that will now filter down at the national level. So the convention's ultimate authority, so this would be like the governance over the convention, is the conference of the parties, COP. And this conference of the parties consists of all governments and regional economic integration organizations, so economic blocks. So governments and economic blocs that have ratified the treaty. All right, so that's the ultimate authority. So the COP reviews the progress, so that'll be global progress under the convention, and it identifies new priorities and sets work plans for the members, the member states and member economic blocs. All right, so this point actually highlights to us the necessity of the review process, because we have to understand that environmental issues are ever changing. So hence the reason we have to be monitoring all the time, collecting data and understanding what is really happening out there, because not only international agreements, but national policies and programs have to be ever changing to fit the world, the changing world that we live in. So the COP can also make recommendations to the convention to create expert advisory bodies, so this would be as needed, and to review progress report by member nations and collaborate with other international organizations and agreements. Okay, so the COP, let's go back there again, that's our Conference of the Parties. The COP is like the governing body for the UN Convention on Biodiversity. So at this point, we have concluded our introduction to the topic of ecological integrity. I would like to refer you to the eClassroom resources for this lesson that have been provided for you, as well as the activity which is intended for reinforcement of your the knowledge and the information that has been shared with you today. So thank you for joining me. Please go to eClassroom to complete today's lesson.